Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Joe Fogarty has spent over 30 years working in national security and law enforcement in the UK and elsewhere. He's currently working on cybersecurity risks and organised crime for the UK's central government. Recently, he's been looking at security and law enforcement through a philosophical lens, through studying for a Master's in Applied and Professional Ethics at IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. One of the big questions for these areas of work is how to balance privacy concerns against the public good. And we'll be discussing that question, among others, in this interview. So welcome to the podcast, Joe.
Thanks, Jim. Very nice to be here.
Great. And we're going to talk about the ethics of national security and law enforcement today. So we're going to explore some issues around, national security and law enforcement, kind of what happens when those things kind of stray into areas where they might look as if they're raising ethical issues, such as, for example, privacy and so on, and try to get to grips with how you make decisions about when operations in those kind of spheres ought to go ahead or ought not to go ahead, I suppose. Those are the kind of things we're going to talk about, right?
Yeah, exactly, Jim. Looking forward to it. It should be a really good conversation.
Brilliant. So I wondered if we could start off by just, if you could say a little bit about what your background is and why you became interested in these issues, I suppose.
Okay, Jim. So hi, everybody. My background, I'm going to make myself feel quite old now, is 30 plus years of primarily national security work, mostly in the UK. I was lucky enough to spend a number of years in Canada helping our Canadian allies with their national security. Part of my time spent in law enforcement, and currently I'm working for central government with quite a big remit, looking after a reasonable size of the UK population, trying to protect them from cybersecurity risks. And my team also concentrates on combating organised criminal attempts to defraud the UK welfare system at scale. And the best way to think about the current job is that's just part of a wider national security remit, given the scale. And I became very interested in coming to the IDEA Centre to have a look at the Masters on Applied and Professional Ethics. A couple of reasons for that. Given my background, my own view is we have a very good ethical construct for the work that we do, but we're always curious and we always want to talk to people. And this looked like a very interesting postgraduate course to take. So you can do one of two things. You can either take a look at what's going on currently in moral philosophy and say, on the back of that, should we change our approach at all? Or equally as valuable, you can come and have a look and say, okay, that's very good. There's nothing here we need to change. So I came with a really open mind, and it's been fascinating to be here and listen and learn again.
Great. You used the word construct there. So you said that there is an ethical construct that's in use at the moment within particularly national security, right? That you were talking about in that context. What do you mean by a construct there? Are you talking about a sort of code of ethics that has principles, or what would it?
It's probably best if I'll give you a couple of examples about what happens in practice. So I'll give one national security, one law enforcement one, and then probably extract from that, given this is the way people make decisions, this is therefore the ethical construct that is in use. So I'll start, I think, with a national security example, and one that relates, because you mentioned privacy earlier, one that relates to privacy. And the example I'll give is a national security team thinking about intercepting the communications of a subject of interest. Right. For whatever reason. It could be a counter-terrorism case, it could be a counter-espionage case. The case doesn't really matter. The thinking is the same. So there's an assumption of privacy. Anyway, a general assumption of privacy in most countries, in the UK, quite rightly so. It's a free society. People should be able to get on with whatever they want to do in their own lives.
So that's an assumption that somebody has a right to privacy.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. And that's reinforced here by the European Convention on Human Rights, which says the same thing. It's a qualified right. And that's enshrined in UK legislation as well in the Human Rights Act. There are occasions, though, where an individual's right to privacy comes into conflict with societal needs more generally, or the protection of the community. So in this particular case I'll use, because it's quite a good illustration, I think, we've got a team that's thinking about intercepting somebody's communications, therefore intruding quite significantly into somebody's privacy. Well, if that decision is going to be justified, the first criterion is what they're going to do must be lawful. Now, lawfulness itself doesn't provide justification to do something. Just because you can doesn't mean you should or you ought to, but it is a criterion. And for one of those operations to be lawful, that team needs to do two other things. It needs to be able to demonstrate that it's necessary to protect the country or to protect individuals, to find out whatever it is they need to find out to prevent this threat from materialising. So necessity is very important. The other aspect of this is not only must it be necessary to do this, and you must demonstrate that, the way in which you're going to do it must be proportionate to the threat that the country is facing. So that's a balancing test between that individual's privacy and the rights of society as a whole. And in order for that operation to go ahead, it can only be undertaken under a warrant signed by a Secretary of State, separately looked at by a judicial commissioner, and they will run those necessity and proportionality tests independently of each other. So there's a dual control. That's not quite everything, though, for that team, for it to be considered ethical. There are two other considerations beyond those. The first of those is this needs to be effective, and there are two aspects to that. The first aspect is the means to intercept that communication must be available. The second is, having conducted it, you must then get the intelligence that you were seeking. If not, you must cancel that warrant, because otherwise that's a disproportionate intrusion into someone's privacy. And then the last criterion is that all of this must be handled very efficiently, because if not, that in itself can threaten national security because you haven't taken action against this threat fast enough. So when you extract from that, you extract 5 principles. So this activity has to be lawful. It needs to be necessary in the interests of society. It needs to be proportionate in terms of interference with other rights. It needs to be likely to be effective, and then effective in retrospect, and it needs to be efficient. So there's a really basic construct there that says if you tick all of those boxes, you can reasonably consider what you've just done to be ethical. I'm going to give another example now because this is quite interesting. So I'm going to leave national security for a while and straight into law enforcement. And a very different example. So I'm going to look now at the case of a law enforcement firearms officer. Now, on any given day at work, any one of those officers might face the ultimate decision for them. Do I raise my weapon and do I shoot somebody? A very significant decision for anyone to have to make. Well, if their decision is going to be justified, very different to intercepting somebody's communications, but if their decision is going to be justified, it too has to be lawful. But again, legality isn't sufficient on its own to enable this to happen. If it's going to be lawful, that officer must have believed genuinely that it was absolutely necessary in those circumstances for them to shoot, in order either to protect their own life or the lives of others. That's not enough for them, though. So that just justifies the decision. After making that decision, their actions need to be proportionate to that threat. So that means using the minimum amount of force necessary to prevent that threat from materialising, and not more force than is necessary. It also needs to be effective. So obviously they are very highly trained. So the likelihood of hitting the target you're aiming at is very high. You're not going to endanger other members of the public. And from the point at which they first think about do I or don't I, to the end of all of the actions they take has to be incredibly efficient, because otherwise that threat will materialise. Now, very interestingly, when you extract those decision-making criteria, they're exactly the same. You've got an interception team in national security. You've got a law enforcement firearms officer over here, exactly the same ethical construct. Now, I've just used 2 examples, right? And these are, you could ask about any aspect of law enforcement operation, any aspect of national security operation. The criteria are identical for both. So the 2 examples I've used there are, these are decisions in prospect. So before taking a decision about X, I'm going to run through these criteria and I'm looking for yes answers to all of them. The other way in which this fairly simple, but I think very powerful construct is used, is you can also use it in retrospect. Post-activity, look back, was it ethical or was it not ethical? So I'll give one example of this, which is another law enforcement example, actually. There's an ongoing inquiry currently into undercover policing, which has been looking historically at undercover policing activity from memory going back as far as 1968. And a large but not exclusive focus of the inquiry is on activities relating to undercover officers looking to generate anticipatory intelligence around potential public order issues. A perfectly legitimate aspiration to do that in terms of protecting the community. The inquiry is still ongoing, but in one of the interim reports they've released already, the inquiry talks about the extent to which, historically, not currently, they aren't looking currently yet, but this is historically, the extent to which information was obtained and released about people's individual privacy issues, about political activities that had nothing to do with public order. Now, you can very quickly start to get a feel for this sort of activity by looking back retrospectively and asking exactly the same questions. So the inquiry hasn't concluded yet whether this was lawful or not, but you can fairly quickly reach a conclusion that says, was it necessary for you to disclose political activity that had nothing to do with this remit of public order? Well, the answer to that looks like a no, a very clear no. If you're disclosing information about a person that is nothing to do again with this remit, was that a proportionate intrusion into that person's privacy? It looks like a no. Well, was the information you generated there effective in solving a public order problem? Well, it can't reasonably have been because it's got nothing to do with public order, so it's not effective either. And if you're undertaking all of this work that didn't meet your legitimate remit, was that an efficient use of undercover policing capability time? Almost certainly not. So notwithstanding the fact there hasn't been a conclusion yet about the legality or otherwise of this, you can look back in time and go, it looks like you've got some particular issues with your ethics here that you then need to learn from and rectify that for the future. So it's a very simple construct that says, if you're looking to make a future-looking decision, ask yourself these questions before you do anything. Post-operation, look back at it and ask exactly the same set of questions. And then you can deduce quite quickly that was perfectly ethical, this operation. This one had some issues to deal with, learn from them and improve. So very simple, but I think very powerful way of looking at the whole of the operational activity of anyone in law enforcement or national security.
Yeah, just hearing you talk about those two approaches, so the prospective and the retrospective, I suppose, strikes me that when you're looking at these cases retrospectively, there might be a bit of benefit of hindsight going on. I'm not talking about any particular cases, but you can imagine how, looking back, you might say, well, that wasn't proportional or that wasn't likely to succeed. But the people in the situation making those decisions might have non-culpably believed that it was likely to succeed or it was proportional, right? So they may have been ignorant of the circumstances in which they were acting in such a way that would make them not fully responsible for that.
That's absolutely true, Jim. And it's a very important part of this construct to say, whatever decision you're taking at that point in time, you're capable of knowing what it is you know at that time. This is the best view that you have at that time. It's really important, though, as a matter of course, to go back retrospectively and look at what's happened, because you can quite rightly then, okay, with the benefit of hindsight, that wasn't as effective as it might have been. Or actually, that could have been done more efficiently. Or there was a proportionality issue that we didn't realise at the time that there is. You can see when you look back in time. And it's really important to go back and do that all the time, because then this system is self-learning. And it's let's not do, okay, we know now. So next time you make a decision, you've got that. What yesterday was a benefit of hindsight, now it's a benefit of foresight into tomorrow's operation.
Good. So on the one hand, you're trying to determine individual responsibility in specific cases, but on the other hand, you're trying to learn and try to improve decision-making in the future. And those two things are related, but they're slightly different.
They are different,
tasks,
yeah.
Right?
And the second part is a systemic look at how you're operating. Yeah, and it's really important.
Yeah, okay. I don't know the extent to which you want to get into particular cases, but like the kind of spy cops case, right, is something that's been in the news and is maybe sort of in people's minds when they're thinking about this. I mean, it seems like in that case, you know, these principles weren't being kind of applied as it was proceeding, right? It just seems like it kind of developed its own momentum and was just sort of going along, and there weren't really checks and balances. There weren't people questioning, is what you're doing proportional? Is it, efficient, and so on. So do you think, I mean, it's difficult, it's asking you to speculate, I suppose, but like, do you think things have improved so that those checks are being more efficiently or more effectively applied now?
I think my sense, and this comes back to my own career experience.
Yeah.
My sense is that system is improving all the time because the system does learn, and there are some very good and very welcome checks and balances on it. External review of activity, which is really important. And certainly from a national security perspective, those teams positively asked for it many, many years ago, because you realise this is a very important thing to have an independent look at what it is you were doing on behalf of the country, because it's a very important role. So I think it is constantly improving. And I think one example of that is, so I mentioned right at the beginning, one of the first criterion is one of lawfulness. But it may be in certain cases that the law might be inhibiting your ability to protect the country, or it might be inhibiting the law enforcement opportunity to protect the country. And there's a question there that says, well, should you then disregard the law in the interest of the country? That's a fairly fundamental question. Okay, the short answer to that is no, and a very clear no. And then I'll extrapolate on why it's a no. Okay, so part of the reason for it to be a no is if you're starting to operate outside this construct, which you ought to be operating to all the time, well, your whole approach to this loses integrity. If it's losing integrity, you're likely, quite rightly, to be losing the trust of the population you're supposed to be protecting. And it's really important not to do that. As in its own right, it's very important. So you want to be operating in a way that says this is predictable, this behaviour, it's got a high ethical standard, and it can be trusted. Well, you do that by behaving this way all the time and getting better at it all the time. That's really important. The second aspect of this, though, I think, is I'm going to come back to the concept of necessity, because this is the route into answering that question about would you break the law or not. Because this is a forward-looking, anticipatory bit of necessity that says, if you see anything in this environment that is leading you or might lead you to behave in a way that's disproportionate or ineffective, it is necessary, absolutely necessary, to raise your hand, say so, and keep saying so until that system changes. So when it comes to, I think we're pretty good at this in the UK. So when it comes to the law, there is always the opportunity, in an anticipatory sense, to raise issues like this before a bill becomes an act. There's a huge opportunity here. And I can see it happening over the course of my career, where ideally you would like the law itself to have these ethical constructs built into it. So it becomes then not a matter of choice, this is a matter of legal necessity. So I'll give a couple of examples of how this has developed over the last 20 years or so. So coming back to that interception and communications example I gave earlier, well, the legislation for that is called the Investigatory Powers Act, which is passed in 2016. That includes in the legislation these concepts of necessity and proportionality that underpin that legislation, which is a very good thing. Now, that didn't happen by accident. That happened by design, as that bill is being introduced into Parliament. If we look at data protection legislation in the UK, data protection has the concepts of necessity and proportionality built into it as a matter of statute. Again, not by accident, by design. If we look, I'll give one more example and I'll talk a bit more generically. If either law enforcement agencies or national security agencies are recruiting and running covert human intelligence sources, there's a code of practice in the public domain about how this must be done. Not surprisingly, the code of practice includes necessity and proportionality as key criteria, not by accident, by design, because you're looking to anticipate what that legal construct might mean in practice, and you're forestalling those issues by getting in there before it happens and not after it happens. So coming back to this original answer, the short answer is no. The longer answer is, if you anticipate it properly, you can put yourself in a position where you never have to face that dilemma in the first place by getting ahead of the game.
Where the conflict doesn't arise.
There
I
we
just
go.
wondered if you
Yeah.
could bring that question to life a bit, though, by just... So what kinds of examples do you have in mind where somebody in a law enforcement or national security context might be thinking it would be necessary to break the law in order to...
I can't imagine the scenario where they're going to.
Right, okay.
What you can see, because I think we do handle this really well legislatively, what I can see is cases where you may have it's not a legal requirement, but it's a policy around something or a code of conduct around something, which doesn't have the same force, obviously, where you can look at something and say, okay, that might have been a very well-intended bit of policy, and today we're not going to breach that policy for exactly the same. It's a lower level reason, but ultimately it's the same reason as not breaking the law. You want to have integrity, you want to be trusted, you want to make sure people know you don't just bend the rules because you feel like it.
Yeah.
But in those sort of circumstances, you want to quite assertively say, perhaps because external circumstances are changing, that if we continue with this policy, this is naturally going to lead us to need to do this sort of thing. We are absolutely not going to do this thing. So we need to change that policy. So again, we're not breaching it. And you want to keep the original intent if the original intent was legitimate, but you need to articulate this differently so we're not going to run into these problems. So part of that construct is a really forward-leaning, anticipatory. We're keeping our eyes on all of this all the time so you don't become static and then you end up with a problem that we should have anticipated this problem. We didn't, and now we've got a real dilemma. So a large part of that thinking, particularly as people get more and more experience in that environment, is say part of your natural role is looking ahead, looking across to say, are we still okay? Does this construct still make sense to us? Yes, it does. Is there anything here that's going to inhibit what we're doing? If so, get rid of it, and get rid of it within the same construct. So coming back to what you were saying on the Spy Cops case, I think we are, just as a matter of course now, improving the thinking, doing it again. I think my example is quite a good example of that. Come to the idea centre. What's the idea centre thinking? What's current moral philosophy saying? Does that mean we should change something? Should we think about it in a slightly different way? Or actually, is it all okay? And I think that's really healthy.
Okay, good. Good to hear it. Hello. This is just a brief interruption to tell you about an event that IDEA the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds is hosting as part of its 20th anniversary celebrations this year. We're delighted to be welcoming Gavin Esler, journalist, presenter and author, to present a public lecture, Dead Cats, Strategic Lying and Truth Decay, on the evening of Tuesday, 17th of June, at Clothall Court in Leeds. Gavin is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster and author. He's best known for presenting the BBC's flagship Newsnight programme. He also spent a number of years as the BBC's chief North American correspondent, as well as reporting in other countries. He's the author of 5 novels and 4 non-fiction books commenting on politics in the modern world. Drawing on his recent book, Britain is Better Than This, Gavin will analyse the state of current politics and truth-telling in the public realm. He will argue that people no longer trust businesses or politicians or journalists as much as they used to, and that this is the result of what he calls the politics of distraction. He will discuss how a loss of trust and truth decay is eating away some of the core principles of democracy in the United Kingdom, the United States, and elsewhere, and will suggest how trust and truth can be reinforced. You can book your place at the event by going to our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics and clicking on the link to find out about our 20th anniversary events. We'll also put a link in the show notes for this podcast. Thanks. Now back to the interview. I also wanted to ask you about mass surveillance. So that might be the other kind of example that people might have in mind here. So, I mean, examples like the kind of NSA case in the US, right? So all the examples you've given and the way the context in which you've been talking has been of kind of targeted surveillance, but there is also a species of surveillance where you're kind of surveilling a whole population to some extent. I mean, so just thinking about those ethical criteria and how you might apply those to that kind of case, you could imagine somebody making the argument that, mass, whatever it might be, kind of surveillance of people's internet habits or whatever it might be, would be proportionate in that you would be likely to turn up, a lot of information that would be very useful in preventing, crimes from happening and so on. So that, you could see how somebody might make an argument along those lines. I mean, is your view that that kind of argument could ever be successful in justifying mass surveillance, or do you just think it's discounted?
That's such a good question. Okay, so I'm going to answer that in a UK context.
Okay.
The answer is no. Does it happen? No. Would it happen? No. Can you justify it? No. Now, I'm not speaking on behalf of any other country. Just speak on behalf of our own. And the way you can approach that subject is using exactly the same constructs as the one I've just articulated. Would that be lawful in the UK? No. Full stop. Hasn't even met the first criterion, so you don't do it. Absolutely full stop.
Sure, but
so
as you said in response to the last question, there might be a question about if you think it's justified, then you'd seek to change the
exactly.
law.
So exactly right, Jim. Right. So you answer the first question, no.
Yeah.
Okay. Then there is a train of thought that says, yeah, but what if we needed to change the law in order to do this? Exactly right. So you go into the others. Do you need to do that to uncover threats to national security? Well, we know by experience you don't need to do that. So why do we change our mind? Okay, if you know you don't need to, it would be entirely disproportionate then to go and do it anyway. What you're then saying is, with this incredible amount of data, if you ever get it in the first place, which you shouldn't, is that really going to make you effective or more effective with this remarkably tiny needle in this now absolutely enormous haystack? Probably not. Is that an efficient way of using your resources? No. What are you doing it for? So coming back to that first one, it wouldn't be lawful. No. Would you consider changing that in a way that meets the other criteria? No, because it wouldn't. But again, I'm only speaking for the United Kingdom agencies and not for what anybody else might think is a good idea.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Good. So, as you said, you've come to study this topic and to try to draw on moral philosophy to try and examine some of these practices and from an ethical point of view. Have you found that there's much in moral philosophy that's been written on this topic, or things that you've been able to draw on and apply and make relevant?
It's not been a subject of much study for moral philosophy. And I was thinking about that while doing the course. And I think it would be quite difficult for it to be a subject of broader study. And there's a reason for this. If you're looking from the outside in, and there's a very interesting book, very recent book by Cecile Farber on the subject, one of the few books on national security and intelligence work coming from a moral philosopher. It's really difficult to do that from the outside because a large part of the activity that goes on isn't in the public domain. For very good reasons, it isn't in the public domain. Yeah. So can you actually understand what goes on inside either national security teams or the covert part of law enforcement? No, unless someone tells you. Then you get into these other questions. Okay, would it be necessary then for a national security team to tell a moral philosopher studying this thing what's going on? No, it's a matter of choice. Would it be a proportionate additional intrusion into someone's privacy to share that? Well, of course it wouldn't. So are you going to be able to see all of this from the outside? No. So it's going to be difficult. I'll say one last thing, and I'll look at it in a slightly different way. That one of the very interesting sets of material I've seen on the subject comes from David Omand. Now, David has a fairly significant chunk of practitioner sitting behind him, because at one point he was director of GCHQ. And he's done a number of very significant public service roles as well, in addition to that. So he has quite a senior practitioner's view of part of that community. So he knows from his own experience what's actually been happening without the need to disclose that in the public domain, and then can write from a philosophical point of view about what that might actually mean for the future. I found that really interesting. And you can see there's a practitioner right in there. And that practitioner knows what's behind the closed door that he hasn't opened. Really, really interesting. And that leads me to probably another conclusion about a really interesting way to do this. And I found this when I came to do it myself, is if you, rather than necessarily looking from the outside in, if you look from the inside out and say, okay, have practitioners come and listen to moral philosophy and what's going on. They know how that system actually operates. Then they go and see what the moral philosophers have got to say about it. And now you've got a complete picture. And it's really hard to do it the other way. It's not a criticism. It's just genuinely really, really hard, right? I found it really, really valuable to come and listen to whoever it is. What did John Stuart Mill say once?
Yeah.
Or what did Kant say once? And is that going to be relevant? And I think that's probably a more fruitful way. And so that probably explains why it hasn't been a particular subject of moral philosophy.
Yeah.
And I think it's because it's really difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what have been the kind of most interesting conclusions you've drawn then from looking at this?
There were, I didn't anticipate some of this when I came, because you just come with an open mind. I'm just going to listen, read, chat to people. One of the things a couple of things actually, going through the course, one of the things I found really, really valuable, and this is a big shout out to my course mates, was the discussions we had as a team. Absolutely fascinating. And the group in my particular course were all practitioners, some from health background, film industry background, financial services, and very different professions, but fascinating conversations about how would you solve problems in this particular, absolutely brilliant. And I took loads away from that. And I think as a steer for the university, I think I put a lot of weight into those discussions, people, because you are really trying to solve practical problems there. One of the things I thought, and I didn't anticipate thinking this, was because I came here saying, is moral philosophy going to add to what it is we're doing? Or is it going to make you feel reassured that what you're doing is okay? Actually, it's the latter, coming away from the course, which is really valuable in its own right. So, okay, I've had a look. Would we change our construct? No. Mm. That's been really valuable. What I never thought about when I first came was, is there anything that law enforcement practitioners or national security practitioners could teach into moral philosophy? Because that's not why I came. And I came, the more I was studying the course, I think maybe there is. So I'll try and articulate this, right? And then you can tell me whether I've articulated it well or not. One of the advantages, I think, of the construct to which we work to is not only does it have integrity in its own right, but it has longevity to it. So if, for the sake of argument, if podcasts were a thing 30 years ago, and you and I were having this conversation 30 years ago, I'd be describing exactly the same construct 30 years ago as I am now. If we were going to do this again in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, I'm entirely confident I'll be describing exactly the same constructs in 10 or 15 years' time. And what that gives you is a tremendous stability about how you go about doing your job without limiting you to a particular way of doing it. As long as you're operating inside this construct, off you go. And it means you can cope with an uncertain future quite well, I think. So I'll go back really, really slightly in time and say, okay, so artificial intelligence is a thing. These days, everybody talks about it. And I think what people are really talking about currently is large language models rather than AI generally. Okay, well, one way to think about this is that we knew how to handle large language models for public protection before anyone invented a large language model. Because before they were invented, we knew if this thing, whatever it is, arrives, well, we're going to operate this thing lawfully. Yeah. We're going to be able to describe why it's necessary. We're going to do it proportionately. Yeah. It's going to work. And it's going to make us efficient. So as soon as it comes along, it's like, is this new? No. Yeah. Well, it's just a thing. Yeah. Well, we handle things like this, yes, yeah. which is really important in terms of, okay, can we harness this quickly? Yes. Because we've got a solid ethical construct, even though we didn't know what it was before it arrived, which to me is fascinating. Yeah. And I think one of the lessons that you can bring out of that practitioner experience into moral philosophy is, okay, moral philosophy has been studied for hundreds of years now. So back to Aristotle, ancient Chinese, Kant, modern moral philosophy. And one of the things I was thinking while studying the course is, okay, is there consensus amongst that group of moral philosophers about what's really important and what isn't? And the answer looks like a no.
Not really.
And if that's a no, to me, that means that ought to be begging a question. And the question is, why not? Either, isn't there an answer? Or is it that the answer hasn't been found yet? If you could find the answer, Jim, that would be pretty awesome. To say, okay, I'll crack this thing. And I think when you look at it from a practitioner's perspective, we'd say, well, we solved that ethical construct problem decades ago.
Yeah.
And we know it works because it's worked and it gets better. You can go back in time and see things that didn't, improve them, all that sort of stuff. And so the way that I look at it when I was reading some really interesting philosophy, chatting to my course mates, the way I would look at it from a practitioner's perspective is, am I interested in utilitarianism in its own right? Not even slightly interested. Am I interested in what Kant had to say in its own right? Not even slightly interested. Are you interested in virtue ethics in its own right? Not even slightly interested, unless all of those things match the construct we already know is pretty good. So when you start to apply those things in practice, you can say, okay, well, if there's an element of utilitarian thinking, for example, that fits really neatly with the criteria we've got, well, we'll have that and we'll use it. We'll jettison the rest of it, though, because it doesn't. Same with Kant. Same with Aristotle. And you can draw on little bits of this and say, yeah, that fits our construct. We like that.
Yeah.
That one doesn't. And that's the sort of stability I think you can get. So I'll say one last thing, because I am a little bit of a fan of some of the stuff that Aristotle used to say, because he was just very clever. So in the construct that we'd operate as practitioners, you've got this framework within which you operate. It's a bit like a box. Never stray outside this box, but the box is huge. And you can do whatever you like as long as you stay inside these parameters. To me, that feels a little bit like phronesis or practical wisdom. We know the premises within which we operate. Okay, we can innovate within that. So you can take that bit of thinking and go, no, we really, really like that because that fits within our construct, and that's actually probably the way we think. So the way we'd look at it is to say, do we need to solve the answer? Which one of these particular philosophies may or may not be the right one? We say, no, we're not even interested in answering that question. We're interested in looking after the public good here within this particular ethical construct, and we'll draw on any bit of that philosophy that helps us. We'll look at other bits. We'll ask the questions we ask of anything to that bit of moral, and we'll say we're going to rule that one out because that doesn't fit with this thing. So I think there is a bit of learning you can take from the practice to say, here you go, moral philosophers. I'm not sure if that's right or not, but it's probably worth thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. There's so much to be said about that. I don't think you intend this, but I think one thing that you have to be a bit wary about when applying moral theories, by doing applied ethics, by applying moral theories like utilitarianism and Kantianism and so on, is what you don't want to be doing is working out what you want to do and then finding a theory which is going to back up the thing that you've already decided you want to do. But that's different from what you're saying, right? You're saying what we have is a set of principles, and then how ultimately those principles are justified, whether it's in terms of one or other of these moral theories or for some other reason, that isn't directly relevant, but sometimes by kind of drawing on the theories, we can understand the principles a bit more.
That's right.
I suppose like
agree.
An example of how that might work, going back to that question we were exploring before about, what if there's a situation where you can help national security in a significant way by breaking the law, right? Well, somebody might make a sort of utilitarian kind of argument in favor of doing that. They would say, actually, look, I'm going to be able to help all these people, and, breaking the law isn't so significant. And actually, your response to that, you could see that, well, it is a no, but you could see it in utilitarian terms as well, right? So you could be meeting that person on their own terms and saying, actually, no, what we need to think about is rule utilitarianism, right? Yeah. And so if we have a rule which says that you can break the law when when there's an advantage to doing so, then ultimately the consequences of that will be bad because you'll lose the trust of the public. There might be a slippery slope where you end up doing that more often and in less kind of obviously justified circumstances and so on. Yeah.
You can take any sort of thinking and say, okay, in order for us not to need to face that dilemma, which we won't, we'll be determined we're not going to face that dilemma, and we can solve that problem. We just haven't worked out how we're going to solve it yet, but we know we can solve it because that's what we do. So you can take any bit of thinking from anywhere, and it doesn't even need to be moral philosophy. It can be anything, a bit of an engineering person's thinking, or Shakespeare, or it doesn't really matter. You've got this fountain of wisdom, right? Historical wisdom. So I can use any bit of this to make sure we don't have to face that problem. So it's quite dynamic. And it gives you the view that everything is connected. If you want everything to be connected, just connect it all.
Right.
And go, there you go. There's a bit of wisdom over there. It's got nothing to do with philosophy, but that is awesome. So we'll have that bit and we use that bit
to refine the framework or construct that you're already using. And with that in mind, I was wondering, so I know in some of the stuff you've written on this, you've been looking at attempts to apply just war theory, right? So for people's information, just war theory is a set of principles or criteria which are used to decide whether a decision to go to war is just and whether actions taken in war are just, right? And it's a long tradition of moral philosophy, goes back at least to Thomas Aquinas, I think. And some people have tried to apply that kind of framework to the sort of context that you're talking about here, but you ended up concluding that it wasn't quite right. Is that right?
Yeah, I did. And I think that it's a really interesting subject, this. And quite a bit of the more recent writing on this comes from David Oatman, who's been thinking about this himself. And I found it really interesting to read what he had to say and to think very seriously about what he had to say. And I'm not dismissing it at all, because I think there is some value in there. But there isn't value, or there isn't additional value in a UK context for law enforcement or national security. And I'll try and explain why I reached that conclusion. So just war theory, in terms of some of the principles involved there, include issues like there must be a just cause to what you are doing. You must have the right intention to what you're doing. It must be proportionate to what you're trying to achieve. And there are a number of principles there. But in effect, you can reduce all of those principles to the principles to which we already operate, because ultimately they all boil down to the same thing. They're just slightly more wordy than these. So one way of looking at it is to say, okay, there's nothing wrong with that theory, because looking at it, it doesn't look like there is anything wrong with that theory. But there's no need for us to apply that, because we already do it. So then you ask yourself the same question then. Well, would it be more effective for us to do this? Well, no, because we do it already. Yeah. Okay, well, if you've got to retrain everyone, is that an efficient? No, it's not an efficient. So it's like a no. So that's just a practical answer. But there's a more fundamental thing. So I'm not dismissing that theory at all, because I think it's very interesting. It's just, is there any need to adopt this? No, not in a domestic UK context. But in that context, there's a fundamental reason not to apply it, and that's because of the connotation of war. So obviously law enforcement isn't at war with anybody. A domestic national security team isn't at war with anybody. Despite what might be spoken about in the press or by foreign administrations, this is not warfare. Law enforcement is part of the local community looking after the community. A national security team domestically is a group of civilians just protecting the country, not fighting wars against people. Now, as soon as you start to extrapolate from a just war theory, in inverted commas, into that environment, you've now got to start to explain why this is nothing to do with war. And people might not believe it. Well, they might start to think, hang on, these people think they're at war. No, we're not.
Yes.
So why would we even complicate that when you don't need to in the first place by incorporating that thing? But I'm not saying it's not interesting, because it is. And if you think about it in a different context, so I'll take an American context, for example. So a post-September 2001 context. So the CIA, for example, are actually doing war fighting in Afghanistan. Okay, well, it entirely applies. This will entirely apply then a just war theory perfectly reasonably to what it is they're going to do there, in retrospect or in prospect. Perfectly legitimate. So I'm not at all dismissing what that theory says. It's just there are some very, very good reasons why you don't want to do this in a domestic UK context, nor do you want to give the impression you're doing it.
Yes.
Because that just creates the wrong impression of what you're actually doing.
Good. Okay, that makes sense. And then just maybe one more question, at the risk of slightly opening a can of worms, but I think it's an interesting question. So you've said at several points in the conversation, this is in the UK context, and I'm thinking about the UK context. So I kind of just wonder, how we should think about differences between different national contexts and between different cultures. So, like, particularly thinking about things like privacy, for example, the way people in the UK think about privacy and rights to privacy might differ very much from how people, say, in China think about privacy, right? So is what you're doing when you're, assessing these criteria and applying these criteria, is what you're doing, you're trying to work out what's valuable to people in the UK and then apply those? And is there then any basis for kind of comparing different cultures? Like, is there any truth about like how important privacy is, or is it just culturally relevant?
Well, that's such a
huge question.
That's such a deep question. All right, so I'm going to give this a go and say, okay, so if you come back to that construct I've been talking about earlier, you start with, okay, we've got a legitimate aim here in the first place. We are aiming to do whatever it is, protect our community, whatever it is we're aiming to do. Okay, within the construct of that aim, these are the questions we're going to ask. Now, to my mind, you can actually apply exactly the same set of questions to a different construct where people have got a different aim, a different societal aim. There was a really interesting bit of writing. I think it was Solov who was quoting a psychologist who'd visited one or more of the kibbutzes in Israel. I think that from memory, the guy's name was Bettelheim. And he said, coming away from that experience, he was struck by the lack of privacy in the kibbutz, absolutely struck by it. And he was also struck, though, by the virtual absence of any antisocial behaviour in those communities and very little need for policing. I just found that fascinating. And I was thinking about it and I said, well, okay, does that appear to be ethical when you think about it? Yes, I concluded, because if you assume the aim there is you want a very peaceful, very relaxed society, does it look like they've got one? Yes. They've got a very different view of privacy to the way that law enforcement or national security would have, which has a much greater preponderance towards not interfering with people's privacy rather than doing so. But do they themselves think it's necessary to behave in that way to achieve that society? Well, it looks that way. To them, does that seem proportionate? Yeah. Does it seem to work? It seems to work.
Yeah.
Well, it's probably fine then.
Yeah.
It's the same questions, but in a different construct for another legitimate aim.
So that's like a sort of mini society in which norms have developed in a slightly different way, right?
But given if your start point is, well, what they're trying to achieve there is a perfectly legitimate thing to try and achieve, looks fine, and you get a yes answers to these questions as well, which I found fascinating. I'll give you a different example, because I think this illustrates some of the power of just thinking this simply about constructs like this. So I'll give you a Russian example, not a privacy one, but a Russian national security example. So let's say, for example, I've sent some members of my national security community to London to poison Alexander Litvinenko with polonium. Ethical? Obviously not. Lawful? No. Proportionate? No. I don't like this member of my former regime, so I'll poison them with polonium. Obviously not. Did you need to do that? No, you didn't. It's really straightforward. That's an unethical system. And it doesn't matter if you've got an aim, a societal aim over there, that's an illegitimate societal aim you've got there as well. Yeah. So you can take exactly this construct, and actually you can do it transnationally in different societies. Yeah. And the key point there is the aim you're striving for, is that in itself legitimate? If yes, you might have a very different societal construct to ours, still legitimate, and it's still ethical.
Yeah.
So I think you can do this transnationally.
That makes sense. Great. Okay, that's really interesting. I've got loads of other questions to ask you, but we've run out of time, unfortunately. So, Joe Fogarty, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Not at all. Pleasure. Very nice to see you, Jim.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes, and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.